This evening's class will be given to us by Brother Ron Cowie, and his subject is, Does God's Laws Suppress Women? And he's asked that we read together Numbers chapter 30. And Moses spake unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. If a woman also vow a vow unto the Lord, and bind herself by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father hear her vow, and her bond wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her father shall hold his peace at her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. But if her father disallow her in the day that he heareth, not any of her vows or of her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand, and the Lord shall forgive her because her father disallowed her. And if she had at all an husband when she vowed, or uttereth out of her lips wherewith she bound her soul, and her husband heard it, and held his peace at her in the day that he heard it, then her vow shall stand, and her bonds wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. But if her husband disallowed her on the day that he heard it, then he shall make her vow which she vowed, and that which she uttered with her lips, wherewith she bound her soul, of none effect, and the Lord shall forgive her. But every vow of a widow and of her that is divorced, wherewith they have bound their souls, shall stand against her. And if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound her soul by a bond with an oath, and her husband heard it, and held his peace at her, and disallowed her not, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. But if her husband hath utterly made them void on the day that he heard them, then whatsoever proceedeth out of her lips concerning her vows, or concerning the bond of her soul, shall not stand. Her husband hath made them void, and the Lord shall forgive her. Every vow and every binding oath to afflict the soul, her husband may establish it, or her husband may make it void. But if her husband altogether hold his peace at her from day to day, then he establish all her vows and all her bonds which are upon her. He confirmeth them because he held his peace at her in the day that he heard them. But if he shall anyways make them void after that he hath heard them, then he shall bear her iniquity. These are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moses between a man and his wife, between the father and his daughter, being yet in her youth in her father's house. And now we'll turn the class over to Brother Ron.
Thanks, Brother Dave. We'll just see if we can get this technology working. You can see that, but it's not moving on for some reason. Yeah.
We can see your.
Now it's going. Yeah, now it's going now. Just hang on till I go to the. This is a two-part series. There we go. So here we go. This is where we're starting from. Okay. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the reading. As we've discussed in our previous class, and particularly perhaps two previous classes, we're dealing with the challenge from the new atheists who claim God's an angry, jealous God. He demands praise and soul worship. God condones slavery. All of these challenges that we've dealt with in some form already. And we come down to this last one where God demeans and suppresses women. And we looked in our last class at the sale of daughters that they claim God approved. And we showed that that was not the case. It was really about the protection of a woman in a vulnerable position. And God was very much protecting those women who had been misled in the promise of marriage, and that they were not then to become just simply sex slaves. So we're coming now to Numbers chapter 30 and looking at some of the laws that also come under challenge by the new atheists. And this is the sort of thing you get from them on their websites. They quote this woman, Helen Gardner. I got no idea who she was, but probably someone prominent. But she said, this religion and the Bible require a woman everything and give her nothing. They ask her support and her love and repay her with contempt and oppression. And that's typical feminist rhetoric that we expect from the world around us today. So these are the objections that we've been dealing with. We're not going to deal with Abraham being called Lord and Master, but We've dealt with the priesthood. We've dealt with the girls belonging to the father's house. We're going to deal this morning with baby girls incurring a double time of uncleanness. And we've dealt with the girls being sold to pay off family debts. And today we're dealing with this matter of males overriding female vows. And the point I want to make about this is that we need to compare the very great positives that are actually built into these laws, especially when we compare them to modern Islam and the laws extant in the ancient world. And when you make that comparison, you see how incredibly advanced these laws were for the time in which they were given, and how much wisdom is built into them for the natural benefit of man, as well as the spiritual education of people. We looked last time at the care for maidservants. I want to just put that up in front of you again. I'm not going to go through all these references, but I'm putting it there again just to emphasize the difference, how maidservants in ancient Israel were to be treated in comparison to the way maidservants are treated today in many Islamic countries, in many African countries, and particularly in the Victorian era of the British Isles, where maidservants were often abused and used and misused because of the power imbalance in those houses. And it's just interesting that God looked after these vulnerable women in this position of power imbalance, because they were the maidservant. They were always included in worship. They always had the Sabbath day off with the rest of the family, and they were not to be abused or lusted after. And God made it incredibly clear that the vulnerable were to be protected by his law. So we come to Numbers chapter 30, which was read for us. And Numbers 30 is very interesting because there's one verse for the males, perhaps two if you add in verse 15, 14 and 15, maybe two or three verses that particularly relate to males. The rest of the chapter is about the restrictions on female vows. And you can imagine what the feminists make of this, is that, you know, a woman who was a spiritual woman wanted to make a vow and her father or husband could deny it. And it's very clear in verse 5 that if the father disallowed it, or later on her husband disallowed it, then the vow was null and void, and she was relieved of any responsibility for not keeping that vow. And in the language, you know, God shall forgive her. So the fact that the vow couldn't be carried through was approved by God. And this aspect of the father or the husband being able to deny the vow was the thing that, of course, the feminists greatly object to. What they fail to see is that God, in the foundation of the world, laid down principles about how families should operate and a principle of hierarchy. You know, the man was first made. The man was given the law. The man was put in charge of the garden. When the law was broken, the man was held most accountable. By one man, sin entered the world, says the New Testament. So God's order of creation was that Adam was first made, given the law, given the charge of the garden, and that was what God said is, that's my order of hierarchy. So right through the Bible, God preserves that same principle, right even into our modern day ecclesial life. And you can't change God's laws, the way God did things. Of course, feminism will never accept that God put an order of hierarchy in place, because their God is absolute equality. And we know, of course, that God has made things a certain way, and we cannot question that. And we see the wisdom in it because of the natural benefits that flow if we keep it God's way. So in the case of this woman making a vow, if the vow was denied by her husband, then, or her father, then the vow was completely null and void. But if the vow was approved, as we read in verse 7, if the husband heard it, or obviously the father as well, and he says, yes, I'm happy with that vow, go ahead, then he becomes equally responsible. And that's what verse 15 is saying. But if in any ways he shall make them void after he hath heard them, then he shall bear her iniquity. So if later on the husband or father says, look, I think that was a dumb vow that you made, I'm not going to let you do that, well, he then becomes guilty for the breaking of the vow, not the woman. And so they had to totally support this once the vow had been made, and they had not exercised their prerogative to say that vow is not going to go through. So the man was responsible for the vow. And of course, I think that was very much the case with Elkanah and Hannah. She made a vow to God, and Elkanah obviously supported it and followed through with Hannah in the matter of Samuel. So it's interesting that the man had the right to say no, but once he committed to it, then he was equally responsible for its fulfillment. So what this did is it avoided the woman from suffering from his indecision, later on saying, oh, I really didn't think that was a good idea, or being blamed for her. He can't say later on, look, that was really a stupid vow that you put up to me. He can't come back later on and deny responsibility. So even though he had the prerogative to exercise leadership, it was not any way he could avoid the consequences of that leadership. What is interesting is built into this law of Numbers chapter 30 is there were exceptions. And so you can see this if you come to verse 9. But every vow of a widow or of a divorced woman, wherewith they have bound their souls, shall stand against her. So a woman who had been divorced, a woman who had been a widow, they could make a vow without having anyone override it, which just shows you that God doesn't think that women are stupid. He doesn't think that women, can't make good vows. He doesn't think that only men make positive vows. I think of Saul's vow about not eating on the day of battle that almost brought about the death of Jonathan. Some men can make very ridiculous vows. But here was a case where God was saying that I want anyone to make a vow. I want you to make vows. But a widow or a divorced woman not being under the headship of a man then can make her own vows. And I think probably a single woman as well. If you look at verse 16, these are the statutes which Yahweh commanded Moses when a man and his wife, between a father and his daughter, being yet in her youth in the father's house. So I would suggest to you that if a woman came to a mature age and was not married, which was pretty rare in ancient times, but if she was not married and she then lived independently, she could make her own vows. It's only when the headship situation applied that that vow could be overridden. So it was a very interesting law. And again, nothing to do with the fact that God hates women. It was just a law that was subject to the principle that was laid down in the Garden of Eden, that there was an order of creation, there was a hierarchy that God wanted respected. And I believe this is the very important law. When you come to the 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul is discussing the role of sisters in the ecclesial meeting, 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 34, let your women keep silence in the ecclesias. It is not permitted for them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And I think you can't find those particular words in the law. This is the principle that God has enforced in his law back here in Numbers chapter 30. And I believe that's what Paul is referring to when he says, as saith also the law. A woman is in a role of subjection to the man because of the divine order that God set up, not because she's in any way stupid or can't make good decisions. It's all about that there is an order that God has placed and he wants that respected. So that's how I would see this law applied in a New Testament context. Okay, well, let's move on. I want to just put this example in front of you before I come to the next one, which is the matter of the uncleanness of the woman when she has a female child. When you come to God's law, there were various levels of application to the law, and the Sabbath is perhaps the best example of the different levels of application you can make from the Sabbath law. So, number one, it was a focus back on God. It takes you straight back to the Garden of Eden. What did God do? God created for 6 days and then God rested. Not because God needed rest, but God did that to set an example for the man. The Sabbath was made for the man, not for God. So it was to be a focus on God. You would think about, the Sabbath, this takes me right back to the foundation of the world. So it was a focus on God. It was a positive ritual that no work was done on that day. And you can imagine the benefit for mankind's health, that he had one day where he rested, his body could catch up, he could get his mental frame back recharged, and even his beast of burden would have a rest day. So it had a positive benefit. God's laws almost incredibly always had a positive benefit. It was a teaching. Man had to learn that you can't dedicate your whole life to doing your own things and your own fields and your own work. And this is a time to stop, think about God and think about the less fortunate, as Isaiah 58 clearly teaches us what a true Sabbath is. So it was also a remembrance. In giving servants and beasts a day off, God says in Deuteronomy 5, verse 15, it's a day to remember your deliverance from Egypt. And that's why we have our day of remembrance, where we stop doing our natural work and we think about God's rescuing of us from slavery and bondage. And it was to be a day of remembrance of what God had done for us in our salvation. But it was also a prophecy. And they were expected to see that this was a prophecy of the future rest that would come, when human labour and travail would be over. And there remaineth, as Hebrews says, there remaineth a rest for the people of God, a keeping of the Sabbath, as the margin says in Hebrews 4, verse 9. So there is going to be a rest for the saints from the burdens of mortality and the burdens of life which we endure today. So I want to just put that as an example, how the laws of God had more than one level. And it was necessary for spiritual Israelites to look beyond the actual law and the ritual and the regulation to the lesson that God was trying to teach them. And this was very clearly come out in the Sabbath. But it was the same with this matter of the unclean female we find in Leviticus 12. Just go to Leviticus 12 with me and just follow through. I'm pretty sure that you'd know the story. I'm not going to go through it verse by verse, but we just need to pick up the principle that is being taught here. And what appears in one sense to be a restrictive law, that a woman remains unclean. And of course, if you're unclean, then you've got a lot of restriction of what you can do. You can't touch anything in the household because that becomes unclean, and you can't go out anywhere because that means that other people might become unclean. You've got to stay home, and you've got to be restricted and virtually isolated, which is something we are coming to understand with COVID, isn't it? The burdens of isolation. But this law says that if a woman bore a female child, then she was unclean as twice as long. So for a male child, it was 40 days. And for a female child, it was 80 days. And, you can see how the feminists would jump on this and say, well, God hates female children, or God is punishing the woman because she bore a female child. This is archaic thinking. This is, ancient thinking. Well, no. And it wasn't that God esteemed females less important. The thing is, why the difference? What was God trying to teach? So the difference was this: the male child was circumcised on the seventh day. And then when he completed 40 days, which of course is the number of probation, then the uncleanness of the mother was taken away. So circumcision brought an end to uncleanness in relation to the male child. Females, not so. So in the case of the female child, you get to 40 days, there's been no circumcision, the uncleanness continues for another 40 days. And the reason that it eventually has to run out, because practically you can't go on doing that. But the fact that it's repeated means there was a lesson to be learned. Not that God hates female children. It's all about the fact that God was trying to teach Israel by putting this in place. And the teaching is very obvious when you come to the New Testament. Without a cutting off of the flesh, which is what circumcision shows us, there can be no end to our mortal probation. And probation will go on, mortality will not be solved if we don't have a cutting off of the flesh. If you just come with me to Colossians chapter 2, it's brilliantly expounded in Colossians chapter 2 about what the crucifixion of Christ actually achieved for us. So Colossians 2, and picking it up in verse 11, in whom also ye are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. So there's been a circumcision that wasn't the natural circumcision, in putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. What does that mean? Well, we identify with Christ's death and resurrection, the declaration of God's righteousness, that even a sinless man testified that this flesh is worthy of death. Buried with him in baptism, wherein you are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God who has raised him from the dead. And he goes on to say, and you being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh has been made alive together with him. Your probation, your subjection to mortality has been removed by the circumcision of Christ, the cutting off of the flesh, which was what the crucifixion was all about. So, there was a lesson being taught for the future here about what salvation would really bring. So, you wonder how many Israelites actually thought about this and what circumcision really implied for the future. And you know, we know that Paul talks about the circumcision of the heart that we have to go through. Well, it was all being taught right back in this law of the unclean female. But note also the natural benefit, this time of separation that the mother had for 40 or 80 days, where she would bond with the child, care for the child, protect it from infection. You think of that. She's got to remain separate from the family, separate from anyone coming into the house and touching them. It was designed in those days when hygiene was somewhat different for the benefit of the child and provided the mother with rest. There are many countries in the world where mothers are expected to be back at work within a day or two of giving birth, and that can't be good for their health. So again, there was a natural benefit as well as a spiritual lesson. That's why we've got to see that in these laws, God was teaching elevated principles at different levels. Okay, well, I may have done this one last time, but I want to just go back to this one because I think this is one of the most wonderful verses in Exodus 34. I'd like you to come there. I'm not even sure if I covered it last time. I may have done so, but I'm going to indulge myself and just go over it again because I think this is a classic illustration of God's tremendous protection for the vulnerable. And this is the case of the feasts. So women were included in all religious services. There was never a case where only the males were allowed to be involved. Even the process of cleansing of lepers specifically mentions women involved in that process. The feast, families normally went together. We know with Mary and Joseph, they went every year when that was possible to the feast. That was something of their family tradition. They did that. So God always accepted that only the males were demanded to go because it was not always possible for women to go to the feast. There might be family reasons, maybe aged parents, very young babies, physical reasons of health, you know, advanced pregnancy. You know, they were not under the law to go, as were the males. So, you know, God provided for the natural problem that a woman may have to stay back at the time of the feast. But he said that the males would go regardless. And it didn't matter whether you were on the border with the Philistines. And bear in mind that most of the feasts were at the time when harvest had been completed or was about to be completed. And that was the time that kings go to the war, the Bible says. It was a time when it was good to invade countries and plunder them because the barns were full. It was an incredibly vulnerable time for men to be away from home and to leave the women folk and the children maybe and the really old people who couldn't travel absolutely open to attack from advancing armies. And God said a beautiful thing. And I want you to look at this is the context of Moses on the Mount being told about the character of God, merciful and gracious, kind, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth. This is the context this comes up in. And so we come to verse 24, verse 23. Thrice in a year shall your men children appear before Yahweh, the God of Israel, and I will cast out the nations before thee and enlarge thy borders. Neither shall any man desire thy land when you go up to keep the feasts. And you just think about that. These women were left in an incredibly vulnerable position. Their children and their farms could be easily plundered when the men folk went away. And I have an imagination about the incredible fun the angels would have in deterring the Philistines and the Amalekites and the roaming armies of mercenaries that were going around plundering other nations. And you can imagine how much fun the angels would have in making sure that no one desired their land or got anywhere near it. And it's just incredible to think that God protected the vulnerable people when the feasts were being kept. And I think that's one of the greatest examples of how much God protected the vulnerable. Well, let's come now to Numbers chapter 5, the law of jealousy. This is another favourite target of the feminists because it seems to be that they would say that only women are ever put on trial and that it was all about catching the woman out and punishing her and stoning her. Well, I would beg to differ entirely on the way they interpret Numbers chapter 5. You're probably familiar with this. This is where the combination of the ashes and the dust is being stored up from a previous sacrifice, and the woman has to drink it to see whether or not she is guilty of the charge her husband has brought against her. Let's just get the facts about the story of Numbers chapter 5. It was designed to protect an innocent woman from suspicions of or accusations of infidelity. And in verse 30, it says, this comes up because a spirit of jealousy comes upon her husband and he'd be jealous over his wife. So there is no evidence here. There is no proof. There's no admission of guilt. This is a case where an innocent woman is suspected by her husband and he's making a big deal of it. Now, the only witness is her husband's suspicion. If there were other witnesses, the Pharisees brought a woman to Jesus and said she was caught in the act. So there were witnesses. But here in this case, there is no witness. There's no evidence. There's no admission. The only witness is the husband's suspicions. So in this particular case, God intervened if she was guilty. Because there was no evidence and no witness, it had to be decided by God. So she went through this ritual of taking this water. And if she was guilty, then she applied, the death penalty would be applied, she would be stoned. Bear in mind, men who committed adultery were also stoned. So this was a very clear thing. God never tolerated adultery. And stoning was the penalty for both men and women. But this was a case where God would determine her guilt or otherwise. You would assume, as Joshua said to Achan, no, even though you're going to be stoned, Achan, give glory to God and fully confess what happened. And the purpose of that is that any other guilty parties would then be implicated, or innocent parties would be let off. So, confession was part of it being stoned even. You had to confess. So if the woman was guilty, then she would have to confess the name of the male adulterer, and he would be stoned. So again, you've got a situation where this was to apply the law equally to both men and women. And this is the great thing, because God is the judge. No innocent woman would ever fear the test, because the judge of the earth always does right. And that's a great thing to remember. She would go into this knowing, I'm innocent, I know it didn't happen, I know these suspicions are unfounded, but God will vindicate me because I didn't do it. And she would never fear the test. So she could do this quite confidently. But if she was guilty, if she had, if for whatever reason she had done something that was wrong, she could go to her husband and say, look, I confess I did it. Please don't get me stoned. And as we know from the case of Joseph and Mary, he didn't have to take it that far. He could forgive her. He could show mercy if he wanted to. But, it was up to him. But she could do that. She wouldn't want to go through the test if she knew she was guilty, because God, again, was the judge and she would be found guilty. So there was an opportunity for her to plead for forgiveness and mercy. And this is the really critical part. A husband who made this unfounded accusation, and maybe his motive would be to get a divorce. He wanted to get rid of this woman, get her stoned so he could marry some other pretty thing in the village. If he'd made an unfounded accusation, he would be publicly humiliated as a suspicious, jealous husband, and he would be silenced from ever talking about that again, because God had made the judgment. And you can imagine no man would make this accusation without being pretty sure of his facts. And it was all about protecting a woman from suspicions and accusations, false accusations of infidelity. And I like to think what it would be like when, after this having been done very publicly in front of the congregation, that he got home. And I don't think he'd be allowed to forget the shame she'd been put through by his false accusation. But it was all about protecting the woman. I think we need to see that. Now, just moving on in Numbers chapter 5, a few other things that are worth noting. As I said, the feminists make a big deal of the fact that this was a law only against women, not against men. Well, I'd like to suggest to you, if you look at chapter 5, verse 3, it says, both male and female shall you put out of the camp if they are lepers. All right, so again, male and female are included. In 5, verse 6, sorry, that's a wrong quote. Verse 5, verse 6. Speaking of children, when a man or woman shall commit any of the sin that men commit and do trespass and be guilty, they should confess their sin. So there's the necessary for confession. But again, you notice how that in these chapters, in Numbers 5 and Numbers 6, that the context is both male and female are included. When we come to number 6, the law of the Nazarite, again in verse 2, speak to the children of Israel, when a man or woman want to be a Nazarite, to separate themselves safely. And then from then on, in verse 3 onwards, it talks about he shall do this and he shall do that. But both male and female are included in the he that follows through Numbers chapter 6. So I would suggest to you that what we have here is a case law example. And it could even be, and I can't prove this either way, it could even be that if a woman was suspicious of her husband, she could put him through the same test. But it was a case law example that in the end, God would make the judgment and the innocent would be found so. But the context of Numbers 5 and Numbers 6 is very heavily weighted in both male and female being included in these provisions. The purpose of this test in verse 31, then shall the man be guiltless from iniquity and the woman shall bear her iniquity. This is the woman, of course, that if she was found guilty, and then, of course, he was then free from the charge of false accusation, the woman would be stoned. But it was all about stopping iniquity. And God didn't want this jealousy, this false accusation happening. And it certainly discouraged adultery, because you knew that if you committed adultery, no matter how much you covered it up, in the end, you could be caught. So again, it was all about stopping we see in society today, adultery is rampant because, of course, there is no judgment. And in Israel's case, there certainly was judgment, and there was even divine intervention to make that judgment. So this process would remove a climate of anger, humiliation, suspicion, and the possibility of family or mob violence. You see what happens in Muslim societies when one of their daughters wants to marry a non-Muslim. Quite often you'll see that the daughter is killed or kidnapped. You might think that's exaggeration. We had a case a month ago in Adelaide where a Muslim family had not only harassed and threatened the non-Muslim boyfriend their daughter was going out with, they actually ended up kidnapping her, the daughter, from work, bundling her into a car and beating her up, and probably were going to kill her. Fortunately, the police intervened. But this is happening today in advanced societies, that we still have this honour killings that are going on because the daughter was marrying out of the Muslim faith. And, interesting, isn't it? All of these things were designed to stop this climate of anger and suspicion, and God intervened to make sure that the innocent was protected. It prevented men using arbitrary grounds for divorce, coming with an accusation of adultery they couldn't prove. And as all things where God judges, others would fear. In the case of Ananias and Sapphira, God judged the matter through Peter, and they were put to death. And it says great fear fell upon the ecclesias. And that's why we know that when God's judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. So, this law had many positive benefits for the nation, but also great protection for a woman who was being falsely accused. Okay, well, let's move on to how much God protected women. I want you to come to Deuteronomy chapter 22. There's a number of laws in this chapter that have to do with women. But we're talking now about the case of where a woman is raped, and in verse 25 to 27, it's very clear that where a rape has occurred, it is punished by death. Under God's law, there were no repeat offences for rape. What a tragedy. Our enlightened society lets out people after a few years and they commit another murder. We had one in Melbourne where a convicted rapist was put out on the streets, and within a week he'd murdered another woman. The enlightened society says that we've got to rehabilitate these people. Well, I'm sorry. The enlightened society has encouraged this because the penalties are so light, and then they get time off for good behaviour, then they get parole, and they just do the same thing because they have no fear of consequences. So again, women were protected by the fact that rape was punished by death. Always, when you read the law of Moses, the man is counted as the most guilty party. So different that is to Islam and other ancient codes. You go through Islam and you see that if a woman is raped, she gets the blame. And, in most ancient codes, it was the same. The women got the blame for it. Not so with the law of Moses. But there were cases, as verse 28 says, it says, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, lay hold on her and lie with her, and they be found, or they be discovered, as it has another translation. This was the case where the woman didn't need to cry out. She was complicit in the relationship. Perhaps the man seduced her, but there was not in this case death for either party, but there were consequences for the man. There were consequences for the woman as well, because the value that the law of Moses placed upon virginity was now in peril. And the family might find this girl much harder to marry off. However, what the law says, if you read on from verse 28, the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, sith humble he may not put away her all his days. So here was a case where she had to marry the man, or he paid a penalty to the father. Now, when you go back to it, compare it to Exodus 22, it seems that there was a provision that if the father thought that this guy was a tremendously unsuitable husband, he's not going to subject his daughter to a life of being married to a very unsuitable husband. In that case, the man would pay the penalty, and that would be an acknowledgement. She would find it harder to find someone else to marry. But in all cases, he was regarded as the more responsible. Let's just go back to Exodus 22 and see how the other law there was stated in this matter. So reading in Exodus 22 from verse 16 and 17. If a man entice a maid, so there was what I said, this was this seduction that has taken place, that is not betrothed, and lie with her, he shall surely endow to be his wife. If her father utterly refuse to give her unto him, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. And that's, when you put those two passages together, in a case of seduction, it was not always obligatory that the woman marry the man. And the father had the right to say, no, he would be a bad husband. I don't want you going into that. He pays the penalty for the loss of her virginity. And he was the one who was regarded as the most responsible, even though she had allowed herself to be seduced. And again, instead of looking at this and saying, isn't it wonderful that God actually says the woman is the more vulnerable, the man is perhaps the predator in that situation, then again, the law of Moses says the man is the most responsible in this situation. I think that's a wonderful example of how God's law was far more enlightened than our modern world is. Let's talk about marriage under the law. Polygamy was never part of God's plan. Polygamy has been a custom in almost every ancient nation, many African tribes, many Islamic nations. The Mormons, the Latter-day Saints have practiced polygamy, and the reorganized Latter-day Saints still do it. And they have these great campuses where girls are betrothed off at a very early age. Polygamy was never part of God's plan right from the Genesis foundation. There's never a good example that it worked out very well. It always brought strife, unhappiness, and jealousy, e.g. the family of Jacob. Never allowed for in the New Testament. Some may have come into the truth already having married more than one wife, which made them unsuitable for some ecclesial office as an example of what God's principles were. But again, it's never allowed for in the New Testament. It's only allowed in the law of Moses in the case of securing the family inheritance. And that was the rare occurrence where a man had died leaving no seed. And in an age when there was no contraception, that wasn't very often the case. But if it happened, then in that rare occurrence, a man could end up with two wives, because in God's eyes, the law of inheritance overrode the principle of one man, one wife. So God encouraged men to have one wife. Live joyfully with the wife of thy youth. And right through the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, God encourages one wife as being the correct way for relationships to exist and families to be profitably raised. So that was the divine principle. There was also incredibly strict control of sexual relations within families. And you can read those laws in Leviticus that actually make us cringe sometimes, because we know what human nature is capable of. There was to be no inappropriate sexual relations within families. And that was very strictly regulated by the law of Moses. So again, who are the most vulnerable to sexual predation? Women and young girls. And that was strictly controlled within families. So again, It was all about the protection of the vulnerable women. Polygamy was never encouraged or permitted, except in that case of family inheritance. If a man had 2 wives in that situation, then the husband had to avoid favoritism. So there were laws that were added to say, look, if you do end up in this situation having 2 wives, then you can't show favoritism in matters of inheritance and the way you treat those wives. And that would have been a very difficult thing to get balanced in that situation. And I believe those cases were relatively few. Very likely one of those was Hannah and Elkanah and Penina. That possibly was one of those sort of cases. We don't have too many others you can actually put your finger on that would actually fit the bill in the Bible. In the first year of marriage, husbands were exempted from military service. That ensured that there was the raising of a godly seed. It protected the new wife. You imagine coming, say, from the tribe of Manasseh and you've married into Judah. You're miles from home. You don't have a telephone. You don't have Facebook. You've got nothing you can communicate with home. You might see your family once or twice a year at the feasts. You're fitting into a whole new family that you hardly know. And you are vulnerable. And if your husband goes off to war and leaves you there, then it's a very unsettling situation for her. It also showed that God wanted marriage to enjoy, that a man might enjoy his wife, it says in that law, and that there would be the raising of a godly seed. And even if something happened to him, there was a child to secure the inheritance after he'd gone off after the first year. So again, it was a matter of protecting inheritances, and it was a matter of looking after the vulnerable woman. So again, God looked after vulnerable women. What about marriage choices? Well, criticism is often made of the Bible that girls were, shopped off by their fathers. There were dowries and things like that, and so there were. And God never gave any laws that arranged marriages were the order of the day. But in the ancient world and today, it was a very common custom. It was something that it was just a practice in Israel that arranged marriages were common, but they were never commanded. The daughters of Zelophehad, who, of course, in the matter of inheritance, got very many special blessings, they could marry anyone of their choice. So this is God almost saying the opposite. God is saying, I would prefer you to marry someone that you select to be your partner in life. The only restriction that was put on the daughters of Zelophehad was they had to marry in their own tribe, because I believe the daughters of Zelophehad actually inherited about a quarter of the whole area of Manasseh. And in doing so, of course, if they had married men from other tribes, then the inheritance of Manasseh would have been split up, which is why God changed his law twice to make sure that situation was covered. And it's remarkable that they could marry any one of their choice, but in their case, it was limited to their own tribe. So again, God never commanded arranged marriages. God knew they would happen because that was the ancient custom of the times. But he said his preference was that people marry somebody of their choice. What do we see in today's world? Well, you can go there today, go to the Islam and the Mormons and see how much arranged marriages take place. In Australia, we've actually had 2 or 3 cases where young girls have been rescued at the airport, 13, 14-year-old girls being forced off to Islamic countries by their families to marry some older man, given no choice, no say in the matter, and at their underage being shipped off against their will. And we've had to actually rescue some of those girls from the airports. Interesting, isn't it? That's the modern enlightened world. And you never hear the feminists, very openly criticizing Islam. The Mormons, as you may well know in America, with the particularly reorganized branch of it, still practice multiple marriages. A book you ever might want to come across called The Witness Wore Red is a great book by a woman who was one of those teenage brides and later on, brought them to court. It just shows you that even today, some people justify from the Bible or from their own prophecies that they have the right to marry very young girls. And again, the Bible completely knew nothing about that. The New Testament principle is clear. You can marry to whomsoever you will. You can have choice, but you have a restriction within the inheritance of the saints. the care for the fatherless and the widows. And there must have been many widows. When you read some of the numbers of men that were lost in war at various times, there must have been many widows in Israel. And that's why God provided the world's first ever supportive welfare system for the vulnerable, for the poor, for the stranger, and for the widows and the fatherless. God provided the tithes and the first fruit offerings would be stored up and distributed as the first ever state organized welfare system the world's ever known. And what a wonderful thing that was, that we came in to provide for those people. God made it clear that the poor must never be oppressed because they are without defense. You know, the man who can afford the big lawyers today can get tremendous advantage because of their wealth and their power. God says everyone is equal before the law, and the poor must never be oppressed because they have no defense. And that was very clearly stated. God's anger would rise up quickly if widows were oppressed. God made it very clear what he thought of those who oppressed widows and what he would do to them. And God says, I am a God that executes the defense of the widows. Just come to Deuteronomy chapter 10. This is a chapter in which we have perhaps I think one of the greatest expressions of the divine titles, the divine name and titles, in verse 17. For Yahweh your God is a God of gods, a Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and a terrible, which regardeth not persons nor taketh reward. So there's a tremendous statement about the greatness and the justice of God, and using all of these different name and titles. And then he says in verse 18, this same God, which is so great, so high, so powerful, he executes the judgment of the fatherless and the widow and loveth the stranger, and giving them food and raiment. And you know, it just shows you that God was concerned for the vulnerable. And so, of course, in our God manifestation, so should we be. So does God repress women? No, absolutely not. God elevated the status of women to a level not known in any ancient culture, nor in most modern cultures. Perhaps the exception is what the world would regard as the enlightened society of today, where women have absolute equality. But of course, they have gone completely to the opposite extreme and left God out of the picture entirely. But the women in Israel were looked after, protected, provided for far, far better than most societies the world has ever known. God cared for and provided for the defenseless, and they are protected from many of the abuses that still occur and women suffer today. Just think about Islam. You know, women going around wearing these burqas. Saudi Arabia has just let women drive, provided they're accompanied by males. You know, so many restrictions on what they're allowed to wear, what they do, you know, the horrors of female circumcision that they practice on their girls. All of those things are completely unbiblical and against the laws of God. And God never required women to dress in any way other than to be modest and careful how they presented themselves. But look at these laws that women have today. And would you want to be in Afghanistan if you were a woman? And amazing how little criticism is directed towards Islamic society by the feminist movement. They attack the Bible and the churches who practice some form of honouring God's principles rather than attacking Islam. And that's where the criticism should be heavily focused if they want to criticise abuse of women. Let's just talk about the Lord Jesus Christ and women, because this is the New Testament perspective, of course, and it reflects the same care, the same respect, and the same honouring of the intelligence of women. Jesus was so different to the teachers and rabbis of his time. Most rabbis in Israel would never be seen talking to a woman because that was somehow demeaning to their maleness. A woman was not allowed to be a witness in court in the times of Christ because women couldn't be trusted to be reliable. And yet Jesus, he spoke directly to women, he taught women, and he personally encouraged women, something a Jewish rabbi would never have done. This second one is perhaps the most incredible one. You think of Jesus and his disciples traveling around with a team of women in support, perhaps 12, 15 disciples, maybe more with Christ, and a dozen or so women following along and providing for their needs in cooking and washing and things like that. but being interested in the teaching of Jesus that he taught. And this traveling with a team of women as a rabbi teacher was totally unconventional in Israel. But Jesus, wasn't interested in the way the Jews had misinterpreted the law. He respected women, and he respected especially their interest in the things he had to say. When Jesus was resurrected, you check it out. He went first to all the faithful women, first to Mary Magdalene, to the other women that came to the tomb. And the one that was missing was a woman who'd been at the foot of the cross and was on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus went to see her first before he went to any other disciples. So he gave to the women tremendous credit for their faithfulness, for their service to his body they wanted to do, for their fact that they sat at his feet and they listened carefully to what he had to say. And he went first of all to those faithful women when he was raised from the dead. And that was a way the Lord showing the great respect he had for the intelligence, the loyalty and the faithfulness of women. When we see ecclesial life, we have women who were valued members and contributors in ecclesial life. Even servants of the ecclesia like Phoebe, who travelled around doing errands and doing things to connect ecclesias together, were valued members of ecclesial life. They didn't hold office, but they were very much valued. And Brother Roberts pointed out that we should always carefully listen to the wisdom of women when it comes to thinking about ecclesial matters. In the end, males are required to make those decisions as part of God's hierarchy. But as Brother Roberts says, a sensible man will consider the wisdom of the faithful women in the ecclesia. And especially when it comes to dealing with other women, because sometimes men don't fully understand how women think. And so, sisters have a very valuable contribution to make in ecclesial life. And because in the kingdom, the spirit gifts will be totally received by all the saints, the foretaste or the down payment or the deposit on immortality that they were given in the first century was that the gifts were distributed to both male and female. And women certainly had the gift of prophecy and very likely also the gift of tongues. So when God distributed the gifts, which were just a taste of the kingdom, then women also got those gifts, including prophecy. And all of that is totally against what Jewish thinking would have allowed. So you can see, can't you, how that Christ did not honour Jewish tradition. He actually respected women, as the Old Testament had certainly done. And he especially valued their sympathetic and intelligent understanding of his words. So I want to summarise now some of the things we've seen about how much God protected the vulnerable women and how different this was to the ancient world. There's not one clause that oppresses or belittles women. In fact, just the opposite. God protected them. Newlywed husbands were exempted in the first year of battle. The law of Moses clearly said that children should honour their father and their mother, which was totally unique in the ancient world. Tight regulation of divorce and polygamy, strong punishment of rape, the inedible death penalty was applied, no excuse, no way out of it, and the man was always held most responsible. Even a woman captured in war had protection from rape, which has never been heard of before or since. It might be in the Geneva Convention, but it's never ever actually operated that way. And Israel, of course, were under very strict laws that women were not to be raped when they'd been captured in war. There was equal access to the whole sacrificial code. There's no case where a man can offer something a woman can't offer. Everybody had equal access to the code. Maidservants specifically included in the family worship and protected from abuse. Opportunities provided for women to serve in the temple. And we see that from the case of people like Anna and, of course, very likely Jephthah's daughter. Women could serve in the temple. And there were women even in the days of Samuel that were serving in the temple. Property inheritance for the orphan daughters. God elevated those daughters several generations to receive a much greater inheritance than their father would have received because of their faithful understanding of inheritance. So again, God respected those women enormously and actually added to his law twice on their behalf. The only time it's ever been done that God enhanced his law was in the case of the daughters of Zelophehad. Equal opportunity to become Nazarites and to offer on the altar with your own hands. So when at the end of your vow, you put the hair on the altar, you did it with your own hands, and women were equally included. The gift of prophecy was given to women like Holdar and others, of course, in the Old Testament we know were women prophets. So again, God elevated women. Equal opportunity to note to the tabernacle. You're probably aware of Exodus 35, but let's just go there quickly. You know, this is a chapter where you can go right through this chapter and just colour in, if you haven't done it before, just colour in how often it says both men and women could offer for the tabernacle. So the tabernacle is about to be erected and they have to collect things for the tabernacle. And in Exodus 35, makes it very clear about how they would do this. And it's very clear. If you look at verse 22, and they came, both men and women, as many as were willing-hearted. And it goes on in that thing. And in verse 25, the women that were wise-hearted did spin with their hands. In verse 26, and the women whose hearts stirred them up. And it goes on in that same language until, of course, the time had come for an end to the offering. But again, was made very clear. Every man and woman could equally donate to the tabernacle and work for the tabernacle to be erected. And there was never any law about it being totally veiled in public. So again, God's laws elevated women far above what the ancient world provided for them. So in summary, is God a moral monster? Most certainly not. He chose one people for his own. That's his prerogative. He required total commitment from them in response. And it's no less different for us, brothers and sisters. God has chosen us out of all the nations on the face of the earth, and he expects a response of obedience. God laid down principles in the foundation of the world, and he doesn't change those values. The fact that man changes their values doesn't mean we need to think that we have to go along with them. All of God's laws had a natural benefit for mankind, apart from one or two minor laws that had teaching put above natural benefit. But nearly all of God's laws had a very definite natural benefit, health benefits for mankind. God loved Israel and wanted the violent and corrupt Canaanites to be exterminated for Israel's sake. And the Canaanites morally deserved what came their way. God had given them 400 years to repent. The time had come for Israel to be preserved from them. God did not permit cruel slavery like the English and the French and the Dutch brought into America and the West Indies. He regulated and guided paid service. Very carefully laid down that when people needed to work for other people, there were strict laws about how it was done. God raised the status of women incredibly. He protected the vulnerable, especially women. And God's laws were just and clear, providing deterrence to crime and thoughtlessness. And we must always remember, when it comes to the laws of the kingdom and the laws that God set down for Israel and the commandments of Christ, God sets the laws of the world, not the minds of wicked men. So, brethren and sisters, let us delight in God's holy, just, and good law. God's morals are consistent. You know, we are faced with a world that is, particularly this woke culture that is out there now, this identity politics, all of this cancel culture we see around us, where we're told we have to accept the modern thinking, or otherwise we're going to be out of step with society. Well, we're happy to do that. We're not of the world. The Bible says this: woe to them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, who completely reverse everything God's laid down that is good, holy, and just. Woe to them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. God does not change. Brethren and sisters, let us make sure that we arm ourselves to defend the God of the Bible against these incredibly horrible charges that the atheists, the feminists, and the modern woke culture will make against our God that we love and honour. Thank you, Brother Dave.